I am a thought daughter. I apologize for this very old, very unfunny joke. It's just very dear to my heart. No, but seriously, for as long as I can remember having coherent thoughts, I remember there have been just way too many of them. So what, you might ask? Well, I became a pro at escapism. Not that kind of escapism. Unfortunately, I'm not bad enough for this. Escapism, as in, if I have a day free of work or study, which happens rarely, but once in a blue moon the stars align, I cannot exist if my mind is not occupied with something distracting me from endless thoughts about my past, present, and future. I should probably invest into like mindfulness and yoga and all of that stuff to deal with that, but instead I invest into consuming endless amounts of content. Healthy? Probably not, but it's very enjoyable and also makes me quite knowledgeable in many different areas. Over the past 10 years, I have watched, read, listened to endless amount of content, and today I want to rank some of it based on its usefulness for escapism. So let's start with the most accessible tool for escaping reality. I cannot say the word escape without my mind instantly going the fate, but whatever. I compiled a list of 12 shows that from my memory were at least somewhat useful for escaping reality, so let's get into that. Just a side note, I'm not adding any anime to this list because I've watched quite a few anime shows, so they can make a list of their own. I gave scores to each show based on three things. First, lore. This is an average of how much lore is in the show and also how much lore is outside the show about the characters and the plot lines and all that stuff. Second one is immersiveness, and this is an average of immersiveness in the show. So, for example, do I need to play a mobile game to fully distract myself from overthinking while watching this show, or is the show itself enough? And also immersiveness outside the show. So this is, for example, does the show have a strong fandom online, which I can submerge myself into and walk around thinking about that after the show ends. And finally, emotional involvement. So for me to actually escape into the show from my reality, I need to have some sort of emotional connection to it. These are all out of 10, so that gives a final score out of 13. I also factored in the longevity of the show, because for escapism, duration does matter. I grouped the shows by total watch time, made the multiplier, blah blah blah, all the mathematical things that I don't want to get into because I barely figured them out for myself and I don't want to explain it because I'm going to confuse myself and think I did something wrong. But the final score is out of 45, and with that score, it places the show in one of the 4 tiers. So welcome the tiers. Tier 1. Borderline concerning. So this is for the shows that completely disconnected me from reality and made me incapable of being an active participant in my life. Tier 2. My friends hate me. This is for the shows that did not disconnect me from reality, but made me properly obsessed with them to the point when I wouldn't shut up about these shows. And as the headline of the tier says, my friends hated me because I wouldn't stop talking about it. Tier 3. Boundaries maintained. Maintained. Sometimes I forget how to speak. Whatever, boundaries maintained. This is for the shows that simply serve their purpose. A healthy amount of emotional involvement, a good distraction, but nothing too crazy. And tier 4 is brain stayed on. This is for the shows that are not necessarily bad, but they just weren't enough to silence out my overthinking, so that's why they're scored lower. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. I think today we'll have the time to go through 8 or 10 of the shows, simply because I have other responsibilities that I unfortunately have to attend to. Whatever, let's get into it. First show, Succession. So, this is a show about an elderly billionaire who, in his very elderly billionaire fashion, promises something, goes back on his word, and that causes a whole circus with his children constantly scheming against each other, engaging in coups against each other, and overall a circus. In terms of lore, I gave it 7 for in-show lore and 5 for outside show. The lore of Succession is its ecosystem of alliances, corporate rules, character dynamics, so all of that. And also importantly, family history, which compounds over time and then lets you see what motivates these characters, because family history is the main motivator for pretty much everything that is happening in the show. I'm not a film bro, so I might be using this word wrong, but for me this show felt like an endless character study on all of the main players. The lore here is knowing who betrayed whom first, what their deals are all about, and what motivates them and their every decision. Beyond the show, there isn't much lore we learn about the plot itself, although I think there are some supplementary materials. It mainly also comes from the analysis of the main characters, what motivates them, their fears, and all of that. For immersiveness while watching, I gave it an 8.5, which is quite high. The dialogue is fast and strategic, so if you're not paying attention, it's very easy to lose grip on what is going on. Plus, the tension of feeling like something is about to implode literally any second really does pull you in. Immersiveness after watching was also surprisingly high for me, because for weeks after finishing the show, I was walking around like replaying arguments in my head, thinking of who said what to whom and why. Also, surprisingly for myself, I was really emotionally attached to the characters. Don't get me wrong, all of the characters are properly awful people, but something about just how low they would go for approval and out of their fears of not being approved and abandonment and all of that, it got me hooked. So with the longevity multiplier, Succession scored a 27.95 for me, which places it in tier 3, boundaries maintained. Immersive, emotionally sharp, does occupy your mind well, but just not enough to make me completely disappear in it. Now moving on to the next, Heartstopper. Crazy turn, I know. Just a quick disclaimer. If you are 20 years old and about to say about how this show is so cringe and awkward, with the most respect, please shut up. You are not the age category targeted by this show. It was made for young teenagers. And for the longest time, the shows that were targeting young teenagers, maybe they weren't as awkward, but at times they were definitely completely age inappropriate for them. And then we're surprised, why do teenagers thrive to act older than they are? So yeah, a 20-year-old me found this show maybe a little too awkward for my liking, but I wish that 12 or 14-year-old me had this show instead of, I don't know, Pretty Little Liars, for example. But this ranking is based not solely on the quality of the show and whether I liked it or not, but on its usefulness for escapism, so let's get into that. Overall lore score was 3.5 for me, with 2 for in-show and 5 for outside the show. It's not to say that the plot was boring or low quality, no. It's just the character dynamics, the events, and the setting is all pretty simple and basic, and there isn't much to remember, there isn't much to memorize. There are some extra materials and comics that were not yet animated, that were not yet filmed, added, I don't know, whatever, you get what I mean. So there are some materials that have not been added into the show yet. So there is some extra stuff outside of the show. For immersiveness, I gave it a 6 for in-show and 7 for outside the show. 6 for in-show because the events and character dynamics are, as I said, pretty simple, and being 20 years old, I couldn't fully relate to them. So, but I gave it a higher score for outside the show because, first of all, I really enjoyed the dynamics of the friendship between the cast members, and also because I do still have some songs by Ouija Project in my playlist, which is Will Gau's music band. So there's that. For emotional involvement, as I've said, I am a little bit outside of the target age category, so I couldn't fully relate to the characters, but it was still very endearing to watch, so I gave it a 6. I'm just looking at the scores. I'm gonna put the Excel spreadsheet with the scores on the screen somewhere just to show you that I actually did like structure this. Overall, Heartstopper scored 17.6 for me, which places it in tier 4. Not a bad show at all. I liked it, just not very useful for escapism. Why was I literally freezing yesterday in my room? But today, when I decided to film a video, it's boiling hot. A little backstory on this one. I am watching a podcast of this really cool guy who used to be a CIA agent who then had to go and serve a prison sentence for blowing the whistle on the torture program. Crazy intro, but hear me out. And in one of his podcasts or interviews, he said that the show Homeland portrays the day-to-day activities of the agency with the most accuracy. So what did I do? I immediately went to watch Homeland. As for lore, Homeland for me definitely had a higher outside the show lore score of 9 because it sent me on a whole spiral of researching all of the operations and events that were mentioned in the show. As for immersiveness, definitely a 7 for outside the show, because due to the said research, I did spend a lot of time learning about all of the events like outside of watching it, but also a high score of 8 for in-show. It was so much fun trying to figure out who betrayed whom and going back to previous scenes now that we know that they were crucial to this event that happened. I also got surprisingly emotionally attached to the characters and gave it a score of 9, even though it's a very love-hate relationship. I don't want to get into it, but like, I cannot say I like a single character in that show, but also I cannot say that I don't care about a single character in that show. Overall, 33.95, which places it in tier 2. I think I talked to my dad so much about this show because I told him about this guy and how interesting his podcast is, and then I talked to my dad about this show so much that I think he stopped calling me because of that, but whatever. And it also gave me a whole new area of interest, so I had lots of podcasts and videos and all of that additional stuff to just listen to as I go about my day outside of watching the show. Now we are moving to the absolute winner, a show that scored a spectacular 45 points. Supernatural. 15 seasons, 229 hours of watch time. Need I say more? Actually, I do, because if it was boring, I wouldn't watch it. I started watching Supernatural when I was about 12 or 13 years old, and I have rewatched the entire show for at least 5 or 6 times. Whenever I have selection fatigue, I immediately go to Supernatural and it never lets me down. There is almost an endless amount of lore in Supernatural, primarily because over all these years, fans contributed so many theories and so many headcanons that later became canon to the show that I sometimes struggle to differentiate what was there from the beginning or what was picked up by the showrunners as the show progressed. Hours and hours of conference footage, panels, interviews, learning about the actual folklore used. Every time I rewatch this show, I am properly obsessed. As you could have guessed, my emotional attachment to this show is also unmatched. I can tell you biographies of pretty much all of the main characters, and given that there are 15 seasons, there have been plenty of main characters. Yeah, I digress here, or I will go on an endless tangent. Undoubtedly undefeated tier 1. Whenever I feel too overwhelmed with my life, I immediately go to Supernatural. It never lets me down. And I can even though I rewatch it every time with so much interest, even though I know the plot of almost every episode at this point. Arcane. So I never played League of Legends. So I'm talking about this show in isolation from the game. But I think even in isolation from it, it's a very interesting case. For me, it scored a strong 35.75 points, primarily, like it not being higher, primarily due to the fact that it's a fairly short show. It's just 12 hours of watch time. The show revolves around Piltover and Zone, which are two halves of the same city with completely different rules, power dynamics, and philosophies. A new technology threatens to completely reshape the balance that was existing between these two halves. Some fragile alliances form, then break, then turn into open conflict, and in the middle of that are two sisters being caught in this whole mess, Powder and Vi. For a fairly short show, it has a surprisingly large amount of lore. The characters' backstories, explanations of the technology, the magic, the history of the place, the power dynamics, there's a lot to think about in there. Everything is very interconnected, so it also takes a lot of focus to connect all of the dots. With additional context added from the games, which you don't necessarily even have to play to know about, I gave it a very strong 9.5 for lore. Sorry, 8.5. I also gave it a 9 for immersiveness overall, because all the power dynamics and history and everything that is happening is engaging enough for you to really pay attention to it in the show, but also outside of the show I kept thinking about it. What this show also did surprisingly well is it made me care about the characters so much in such a short period of time. I was walking around just constantly thinking about the whole dynamic between Powder and Vi and how tragic it is. Silco, the found family versus biological family. I once watched a TikTok about Powder and Echo and almost cried. So yeah, a very strong 10 for emotional engagement. Naturally, as it's in tier 2, my friends hate me. I would not shut up about this show. And I was very happy to learn that my sister watched and liked this show and I can talk to her about it. Then I got slightly worried that she's a little too young to watch it, maybe. But still, yeah. Next one is going to be a combination of two shows because whenever I rewatch it, I usually watch both. So it's Avatar: The Last Airbender and Avatar: The Legend of Korra. Now I know that many people really dislike Legend of Korra and don't really acknowledge it as a sequel to Avatar: The Last Airbender, but I strongly disagree with this sentiment. For me, The Last Airbender was the perfect childhood show, and Korra is a perfect sequel to it to introduce a more nuanced, maybe darker but realistic take on the story. I gave both shows a 9.5 for lore inside the show because the universe is complex and it's also very consistent while constantly evolving with every new episode. The rules of bending, the avatar cycles, the past avatars, the power dynamics, the consequences of having the power of avatar, the power structures, all of that is very clearly established in The Last Airbender and then from that expanded in Korra in a meaningful way. And I say meaningfully expanded in Korra because it's not just repeated. It built on what was created in The Last Airbender and expanded in Korra, and it does make you go back and look at what was introduced to see how all of that was like coherently elaborated throughout the series. This, in its turn, is a great thing to occupy your mind. Plus, the cultural context that is very inherent to the show and learning about it also adds something to like occupy your mind with researching it. Immersiveness was also a 9 all around. Although the animation is simple, it's very enjoyable and very nice to watch, and the dialogue, granted simple, is very engaging, and I really enjoy watching it every time, even though I also know pretty much all of it by now. With an obvious 10 for emotional engagement, which you probably could have already guessed, Avatar scores 37.05, which places it in tier 2, My Friends Hate Me. Which is very, very true, because if I know you watch this show, I am going to never shut up about it until I discuss everything about it with you. I started watching the next show when I had my first unrequited crush, and it was so perfect to make me disassociate from constantly thinking of what is wrong with me, am I not good enough, why is my life like this, blah blah blah. This is probably because of how shocking this show was for me at the time, although completely age inappropriate. Which is why I gave Shameless 9 for emotional involvement. Nevertheless, after trying to replicate this effect a couple of months ago, I realized that without the emotional involvement that I somehow formed with the show when I was 12 years old, Shameless isn't actually as good for the purposes of escaping reality as I thought it was without this emotional attachment. I gave it a 6 for in-show lore and 4 for outside the show lore, because the storylines, although shocking, became very repetitive after the first seasons, so it wasn't as engaging watching them when I could pretty much predict what was going to happen from when the storyline began. The vibe and aesthetics of the show and the shock value really carried the immersiveness in show to 8 for me, but it did not necessarily translate to outside of the show, so I gave it a 4. Overall 30 and tier 2, primarily due to the shock factor and some residual nostalgia. It is good, it's not bad. It does occupy your mind and it does distract you for a while, but more so earlier seasons, I would say, rather than later seasons. Last show I want to mention is something I'm worried to bring up, even though I ranked it high, simply because of how opinionated the fan base can be. Sopranos. I also have a complicated relationship with the show. 8.5 for the lore, losing 1.5 points for the lore because it is an odd situation with this show, right? The lore and the storylines are great, but they are a little too realistic, if you know what I mean. It was difficult to follow the storylines disconnected from real life. I would think about what is happening in the show, inevitably link it to real life, and bam, I'm back there. I'm back in reality instead of escaping it. Overall, I gave this show a score of 37.01, which places it in tier 1 borderline concerning. I was obsessed with the show. I was thinking about it all of the time, but I was not disconnected from reality while I was thinking about this show. I have a complicated relationship with the show, right? I was obsessed with it. It really like immersed me into that universe whole, but instead of being disconnected from reality, it kept just pulling me right back into it. But at the same time, it's not my reality. So I don't know. See, that's why I cannot place it anywhere else other than tier 1 because of how obsessed and consumed I was by it, but also I am still conflicted about this show. So this is it for today. I think this video is gonna be long enough. Every time I tell myself, you gotta make shorter videos, and I can never make my videos shorter. Whatever. I have a lot more shows to go through, so if this is interesting, I might do this for other shows as well because I gave scores to all of them. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video and subscribe to my channel.